Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. All that we're running from seems to stay right behind us, while all that God is leading us to seems to be getting further and further away. As the miles pass, it's easy to feel alone. It's easy to feel lost. And yet, if we know what to look for, the reminders of God's faithfulness are all around us, shaping us, molding us, preparing us for what's ahead. Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. The road can be hard. The road can seem to stretch forever. There will be moments of frustration, moments of doubt, moments when you want to quit. But as we learn to trust God and follow where He leads, we may just find that some of our best growth happens in the wilderness.
I'm always fascinated by it, and you just never seem to know what's going to catch in the world of popular culture and entertainment. I remember as a kid, it seemed like there were about 800 different game shows on the air, and I know that because every week when my grandma came to our house to do her laundry, she watched 784 of them in a row, and we would sit in the living room, and it was this incredible spectacle of lights and sounds and fabulous prizes. And then as that gave way to a whole bunch of people who decided they were going to rip off Judge Judy, who was just ripping off the original of the courtroom television drama, Judge Wapner of the People's Court. But there for a while, it seemed like everybody who had ever been a D-list celebrity was settling small claims on the air for our personal entertainment. I remember when I was in college, Survivor hit the air and became this incredible craze that launched an entire new genre of reality TV. Everything from The Bachelor to Big Brother. I mean, if you had told me 20 years ago that The Bachelor would still be on television, I would have said you're crazy. This is ridiculous, right? But there came a point in the early aughts that the world was introduced to survivalist TV. It all kind of got started with a guy by the name of Bear Grylls who would invite you to go on adventures with him into the wild on his show aptly named Man vs. Wild. Now, before he got his TV show, though, he was an adventurer. He went on several expeditions, including scaling Everest, which always gets people top-notch survivalist cred in my book if you're taking on that challenge. He also navigated the northern Atlantic from Nova Scotia, Canada, to Scotland with 4 other guys in an inflatable boat. All right, so the guy kind of knows his stuff about taking on the challenges of the wild. And the show was pretty simple. Every week he would head out into the jungle or the desert or the mountains with a camera crew, and he would demonstrate some worst-case scenario survival skills. Right? They would scout the locations ahead of time, figure out where they could show some different things that would make for good television, and the show would then show him, facing the challenges. So if you were ever hiking in the Sahara Desert and got bit by a rattlesnake, you would know what to do, or if you happen to be, trudging through the Amazon jungle and you happen to fall into quicksand, which, by the way, television as a child made me think was going to be a much bigger issue, right? Like, we just thought quicksand was everywhere. But if you happen to be in that scenario, it'll show you how to get out of that. And the show caught people's attention because it would show him doing and eating whatever it took to survive, whether he's foraging for edible insects or recycling his body's water to stay hydrated. The show kind of had this propensity for showing us things we didn't know we needed to see to survive the modern world. And in time, of course, lots of knockoffs began to emerge. And so a genre that at one point would have been buried on the 300s on your cable box made its way to major primetime network TV. Bear Grylls spun off his fame from Man vs. Wild with a network show where he invited celebrities to go on these outings with him. In case you ever wanted to see Ben Stiller go rock climbing in the Scottish cliffs, you can check that out. It's out there, right? And so this thing that should have been seemingly very niche made its way into the mainstream. And as Adventures to the Wild became a staple on TV, I think it began to kind of romanticize this idea of life in the wilderness. Quicksand, rock slides, lions and tigers and bears, right? Adventure around every corner. Now, off camera, Bear Grylls is on the record of saying, if you ever find yourself in a survivalist scenario, just make yourself comfortable and wait for somebody to come get you. You don't do anything. That's his pro tip. If you're ever actually lost in the wild, just hunker down and wait. That probably doesn't make for great TV, though, right? So they would go out of their way to find things that they could kind of recreate and demonstrate these survivalist skills about the adventures that are out there. And certainly, there are dangers beyond the borders of culture. There are dangers and adventures to be had. But I think if we're honest, the real challenge of life in the wilderness is a sense of feeling stuck, of feeling like you're lost and disoriented, and unsure where to go, how to get there, what to do next. Over the next few weeks, we want to step into a season of life for the people of God in the Old Testament, a crucial season of life in the wilderness after God's people had been rescued from slavery in Egypt. And I want us to spend some time with this season in the life of God's people, because while you and I will probably never find ourselves fleeing from Pharaoh with 600,000 of our closest friends, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's probably unlikely. But I think we know what it is to find ourselves in the wilderness sometimes. To see God at work in the past, and to have some sense, some understanding that He's leading us somewhere. But at the moment, feeling very lost, feeling very alone, feeling disoriented, and at times even feeling abandoned by the God who promised to save us. We know what it is to experience the wilderness. We just aren't always sure what to do with it. And so my hope in the conversation we have over the next few weeks is to begin exploring the life of God's people in the wilderness so that we can begin to learn some things about who God is and what He's like, and how we can navigate our own sort of wilderness seasons. Because whether you've been following Jesus for years and years, whether you are new to the ways and words of Jesus, or maybe you're just exploring faith, you're just checking things out, you're not sure about any of this, I truly believe we all have these moments where we find ourselves stuck in the wilderness. We experience these seasons where we're just not sure where we are, what we're supposed to be doing, or where in the world we're going. And so we find ourselves in those seasons feeling very restless and helpless and rootless. So over the next few weeks together, we want to look into this season in the life of God's people in the wilderness and see what we can learn. And so we're going to begin navigating our way through a big idea. It's there in the teaching notes. If you want to follow along in the YouVersion Bible app, just go to the events tab and you can jot some things down there. All the scripture and teaching notes will be there for you. The big idea we want to begin exploring in this conversation goes like this. Time in the wilderness is typically time in between where you've been and where you're going. Seasons when we find ourselves feeling like we are in the wilderness, so to speak, that time in the wilderness is typically time in between where you've been and where you're going. There are these seasons of life when everything seems up for grabs because one season has ended and the next one hasn't quite come into focus. And sometimes the wilderness catches you because the things that you thought you knew God was doing, you no longer see Him doing. Where you thought God was leading you has reached a dead end. And now you're just not sure what to do next. And so wilderness seasons have this way of pairing two emotions that don't go well together for us. There's a restlessness to them, and there's a boredom to them. Right? Because think about what Bear Grylls said. If you ever find yourself in the wilderness, don't do anything. Just get comfy, hunker down, and wait for somebody to come get you. That is a perfect recipe for restlessness and boredom that sets us up to make all sorts of decisions and all sorts of choices that are not rooted in who God is and what He's like, but are rooted instead in the circumstances we find ourselves in. We feel like in the wilderness nothing is happening. It's mundane, and we find ourselves longing for more. What I want to suggest to us in this conversation, gang, is that often those are the times where God is shaping and molding us as He was doing for His people Israel. But Israel's time in the wilderness doesn't begin with Israel in the wilderness, but rather it begins with Israel in Egypt. The book of Genesis in the Old Testament comes to a close where Joseph, the son of Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, has ascended to number 2 in the entire kingdom of Egypt, which at the time is the world empire. Egypt is the big dog on the block, and Joseph, through a series of events, we will walk through that story sometime. I love it. It's one of my favorite moments in the Old Testament to trace Joseph's story. But for now, suffice it to say, he finds himself going from being a prisoner, rising to second in command over the world's most powerful empire, right-hand man to Pharaoh. That's how the book of Genesis concludes. In a time of famine, he has brought his entire family, his father's entire clan, to the land of Egypt because of a famine in their homeland. Anyway, Siri's trying to tell you the story of Joseph, and I don't think I'm going to let her do that today. So Joseph brings his entire family to Egypt. because of famine in their homeland of Canaan. And they settle in and they make themselves at home. And the book of Exodus, it tells us about the way that they begin to experience the blessings of God, because way back when God promised their father Abraham that he would make him into a great nation. And Exodus says that's beginning to happen. It's just taking place in Egypt. And then the book of Exodus has this incredibly ominous line that a new king came to power who did not know Joseph. I love one translation puts it like this. They said, a new king arose to whom Joseph meant nothing. Joseph, who's he? Never heard of him. And instead, what Pharaoh does is he looks around and he sees the descendants of Joseph and his brothers multiplying and increasing in number, and he begins to get nervous. He says, they're expanding, and if they ever decided to rise up against us, they may take Egypt for their own. And so the king to whom Joseph means nothing enslaves the descendants of his father Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And God's people find themselves in bondage to Egypt and to Pharaoh. And as they continue, even in their enslavement, to multiply and advance because of the blessing of God, Pharaoh continues to get nervous. So he makes a declaration throughout the land that every male Israelite Hebrew child is to be thrown into the Nile. And the book of Exodus tells us of the heroic work of two Hebrew women whose names we do not know, who were midwives to their people, who did all they could to prevent the slaughter of the innocents. And they tell us particularly of one such child born to Hebrew slaves who was hidden away by his parents until they could no longer keep his birth a secret. And so they prepare a basket and set him adrift on the Nile River, where he is soon discovered and adopted and raised by the daughter of Pharaoh. And all of the sudden, the king to whom Joseph meant nothing finds himself with another Hebrew rising up through his courts. And Exodus introduces us to Moses, the son of Hebrew slaves, raised in Egypt's courts, educated on life in the palace, on diplomacy. But Israel's time in the wilderness doesn't begin with Israel in the wilderness. It begins with Moses in the wilderness. And he got there because one fateful day, his two worlds would collide. If I should have turned with me this morning to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. We want to pick up the text here in verse 11. Again, everything will be on the screen for you. Open a Bible, click on a device in YouVersion. The scriptures will be there for you. You can follow along and take some notes if that's helpful to you. Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. We read this. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched him at their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So Moses' two worlds come to collision here. He goes out and watches over his own people at their hard labor, and he sees a fellow Hebrew being mistreated by an Egyptian. And Moses, in what the text makes clear, is a planned out action. Looks this way and that to make sure no one is watching. Kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. So, if you're on some relationship with a wilderness season and you feel like you're too far gone, just hold that thought, okay? Like this isn't accidental. It's not Moses trying to intervene and trying to be the good guy and something happened. No, he looks to make sure no one is watching, kills the Egyptian, and buries his body in the sand. And so the next day, when he sees two of his countrymen fighting, he again tries to intervene. And his fellow Hebrew says, "Who do you think you are? You gonna kill me like yesterday? Yeah, we heard that story, Mr. Big Shot from the palace." And word reaches Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tries to have Moses. Remember, there's that whole fear that if they ever decide to rise up, they may take Egypt for their own. And now one of their own who lives within the palace is taking out Egyptians. And so Moses flees. And the text tells us he runs to Midian, which I'm guessing for most of us doesn't mean a whole lot. Like, we're just probably not all that familiar with the geography in question. And so I wanted to situate this on a map for us so we have this in our minds as we go through this conversation. Moses is in Egypt. And when he runs away, he runs away. All right, so I don't know if you can make this out. This little, the key down here at the bottom, that little line is 50 miles, so you can kind of plot that out. When Moses decided to flee to Midian, he was fleeing. And the text will go on here in Exodus chapter 2 to tell us that Moses sits down by a well, but he's not there alone very long. So some women come to draw water from the well, and some shepherds begin to harass them, and Moses drives the shepherds away, rescuing these women. They return home to their father, Jethro, who the text is going to tell us in a moment is a priest of Midian. And it's kind of one of those moments I think we're supposed to chuckle. Like, we don't give ourselves permission to laugh our way as we're reading the Bible because it's like the Bible and it's like thou shalt not kind of stuff. But Jethro's like, so where's the guy that saved you from the shepherds? Like, bring him home. Like, we could at least offer him a meal, right? And so they go back, they get Moses. Jethro welcomes him into his home and ultimately marries off one of his daughters to Moses. This is a side note. This is one of those times. This is completely unrelated to what we're talking about with season in the wilderness. But because of this larger sense that we have as a community of faith, that God would call us as His people to reach the whole of our community with its diversity by beginning to reflect the diversity within our own body. Let's not miss the fact that Moses, the guy to whom God gives the law, marries a girl from Midian. So let's just be clear, this idea of the people of God has been diverse from the start. That is completely unrelated. Couldn't preach this text without reminding us just how much those things have their fingerprints on the story of Scripture. So Moses marries Jethro's daughter. And 40 years later, finds himself in the wilderness. He finds himself in his father-in-law's employ in the wilderness. Let's jump down to chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight while the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Verse 5, Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So 40 years after he flees to Midian, Moses finds himself in the wilderness. His anticipated future, growing up in the palace, is gone. All of his training in the ways of the court, all of his training in the ways of Egyptian diplomacy, in military strategy, it's all gone. It's wasted. He's just a guy tending his father-in-law's flocks. And one moment in his life seems to have changed the entire trajectory of what he thought was going to be. Until this moment shows him what the trajectory was supposed to be all along. Moses is tending his father-in-law's sheep when a bush speaks to him. Okay, again, we've got to give ourselves permission to hear the story of Scripture as if we don't know what's supposed to happen, right? We just read passages like, oh yeah, the burning, like it's burning bush moment. That's a thing, right? We know what that is. So let's be amazed. Let's marvel at this. Let's not downplay what's happening and how wild this is. Moses is hanging out with the sheep, and the bush speaks. Or more correctly, God speaks to him from within the bush. He hears the voice of God from within this bush that is on fire but is not burned up. And Moses says, I'm going to go see what this is all about. We're like, well, of course you are, Moses. I'd do the exact same thing. What in the world is happening? Moses goes to investigate, and the bush speaks his name. And when Moses says, here I am, the posture of a servant, I'm listening. God tells him, take your shoes off. This is a holy place. Right? And I think here's what we have to begin to get our head around if we're going to make sense of life in the wilderness, because we tend to write off our time in the wilderness as if it is wasted, as if it is lost potential. But when God steps on the scene, even the wilderness becomes a holy place. He says, Moses, take off your shoes. I've heard the cries of my people. Their cries of distress have reached me, and I am concerned. And so, Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out. So here's Moses in the midst of a moment that he probably thought would be the rest of his life for the rest of his life. Chasing these sheep out in the wilderness. And all of a sudden, in a moment, it is transformed into an in-between time. Moses is no longer where he's headed. He's now somewhere between where he's been and where he's going. And I think we can begin to learn a bit about wilderness seasons in our life that we see on display here for us. It's there in the notes if you want to jot it down. The wilderness can be the place that you go so no one can find you. Or it can be the place God takes you to find your purpose. Right? This is what's happening for Moses here. The wilderness can be the place that you go so that nobody can find you. Moses, fearing for his life, flees to Midian, about as far away as he can get from Egypt. It can be the place you go so no one can find you, or the wilderness can become the place that God takes you to find your purpose. And what happens often is we find ourselves in the wilderness on the heels of life falling apart. Right? Everything has gone sideways. The job that we loved is gone. The relationship we thought was going to last a lifetime has ended. The thing that we felt called to do with such certainty no longer feels possible. And so we find ourselves in between, feeling stuck, feeling lost, feeling alone, at times feeling abandoned. And sometimes we can end up in the wilderness in one of these in-between times without moving an inch. And sometimes we end up in the wilderness because, like Moses, we are fleeing to an in-between time, assuming whatever used to be possible isn't possible anymore. Until God shows up and turns the wilderness into holy ground. And all of a sudden, the wilderness that we ran to so that nobody could find us becomes the place that God takes us so that we can find our purpose. So that we can once again discover what He has called us for. From the midst of the burning bush, God says, Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Moses, I'm sending you. The guy who grew up seeing the injustice against your people normalized. Moses, I'm sending you. The guy who, when you saw that injustice, decided you were going to try to fix it. As if I were not concerned myself. Moses, I'm sending you. The guy who grew up learning the ways of the Egyptian court. The guy who was primed and prepared to help rule and govern the greatest empire in the world. Moses, I'm sending you to lead my people to the place I promised them. See, guys, the wilderness can be the place you run to so that nobody can find you. Or can it be the place that God takes you to help you find your purpose? And so often when we find ourselves in these wilderness seasons, we just aren't sure what to do next. A lot of times we don't even know how we got there. We don't know how it all went sideways, and we aren't sure there's a way back. How many times, sitting in the wilderness, chasing his father-in-law's sheep, did Moses replay that day in his mind? If I'd done this, if I hadn't done that. And he feels stuck. And he's assuming this is going to be the rest of his life, for the rest of his life. See, God has a way of turning the wilderness into holy ground, of meeting us in those places to help us find our purpose. In the course of this conversation, I want us to see how God did that for Israel in their own 40-year wilderness season, and draw out some principles of God's character, who He is, and what God is like, so that we can navigate those seasons of our own. I invite the band to come back. We're going to continue in worship. What I think we're going to see, both in Israel's time in the wilderness following the Exodus, what we begin to see reflected here in Moses' moment in the wilderness, is this tendency that I think we share with them to assume the wilderness is all about what is happening to us, when oftentimes the wilderness is about what God is trying to do through us. So when you find yourself in the midst of the wilderness, do not settle for it being a place that you hide from the pain of your past. Let God begin to transform the wilderness into holy ground, where He will show you the purpose for your future. Can I pray for us?